National War Crimes Tribunal has to be allowed to do its work and find out what's happened inside. An international security force must go back in with the refugees and with the verification mission to make this thing work. The political negotiations with the Serbs and Albanians must be restarted under international supervision. There are a couple of other points that the White House had put out, but the core ones are self-evident, and the offensive must stop. Above all, the slaughter must stop, the refugees must go home, and the international force must come in.
What's the best? You and I have had a chance to talk about this, so I've got lots of questions that come from everywhere.
It's been hours since I've been on your show, Charlie.
Yes. In the end, what's the best settlement for Kosovo? Is it autonomy? Is it partition? Is it some kind of agreed-on security force that includes Russians to keep the parties from each other's throat?
Well, the Russians are welcome to be part of this international security force I talked about. I myself have talked to the Russians about it. Secretary Albright has talked in length to Foreign Minister Ivanov. The President and the Vice President have talked to Yeltsin and Primakov. So the Russian role is acceptable. The Russians have 2,000 people in Bosnia, as you and I have discussed previously. But beyond that, I think that the core issue between Albanians and Serbs, which is a really deep ethnic hatred. You know, you and I discussed Bosnia many times. In Bosnia, same language, same cultural traditions, different religions, but tremendous intermarriage. People had switched religions over the centuries. Albanians and Serbs are different, and your viewers should understand that. These are different languages, different cultures, and very separate traditions, and they coexist in the same small little Connecticut-sized space called Kosovo, each of them claiming ancient historic roots there, and each of them, to be honest, with some legitimacy to their historical claims. They got two choices. They either can live together in peace, or they can kill each other in a kind of, the same kind of situation that went on the West Bank and Ireland for so long. Now, in order for a political settlement to work, both sides have to agree to live in peace. The Rambouillet Agreement, the 81 pages of the Rambouillet Agreement, which the Serbs rejected, contain all the elements of a really solid interim solution, while leaving the future after 3 years to be decided later. It provides for separate legal systems for both the Serbs and Albanians, which is essential, because you can't have Albanians arresting and trying Serbs and vice versa. It provides for cultural respect, separate schools, religious respect, self-governing status for the Albanians while protecting the rights of the 10% of the people who are Serb, and this international security force which would protect it. So, although Rambouillet itself was rejected, the principles embodied in the Rambouillet Agreement make a hell of a lot of sense.
So as far as this administration is concerned, what they want to do is see an agreement, see an acceptance of Rambouillet. That's what they want. They have, the president indicated at one point that he was beyond that, and he thought circumstances had driven and events had driven circumstances beyond an acceptance of that. But he's...
Listen carefully to what I said. You asked what it would take for Albanians and Serbs to have a political solution. I said all the elements are in the Rambouillet Agreement. The 81 pages of the Rambouillet Agreement may, in their current form, be changed, transmogrified, adapted. All I'm saying, I don't change, what the President and Madeleine Albright have said on Rambouillet is definitive. They speak for the administration. But what I'm saying is, in response to your specific question, the elements of a political compromise between Serbs and Albanians so they both can live together in peace on the same land are all in those 81 pages.
Milosevic. No American, maybe Clinton is the only exception, no American, no, there's no American who knows him better than you do.
Oh, thanks, Charlie. You say the sweetest things.
Has anything he has done surprised you?
Well, I am surprised that he made such a bad decision 2 weeks ago today. I sat 2 weeks ago today for God knows how many times I'd done it before. I sat in that big room in the palace, and I said to him, you understand that if our delegation leaves here today and you haven't changed your position, that the consequence will be the beginning, within a few hours, of a very swift, severe, and sustained aerial attack by NATO forces. But if you agree to our proposition, we will send in, by invitation, 28,000 NATO and Russian peacekeepers, including Americans. They will work closely with the security forces of Yugoslavia to bring peace to the area. As President Clinton has said, they will protect the Serb population from the Albanians. They will protect the Albanians from the Serbs. They will disarm one side and the other side will withdraw. And the choice is very clear. And you ask me if I'm surprised. I am disappointed and somewhat surprised that he chose, at that point, knowing exactly what he was doing, to trigger the bombing upon himself.
Because he knew that it would cause Serbs to rally around him? Because he knew it would make him and enhance his reputation with his fellow countrymen and women?
He had complete control of the press, complete control of the National Assembly before the bombing. So when you read in the papers that he's getting additional outpouring of nationalistic support, I don't think that's politically very valuable to him. His oil supplies, his oil refineries have been shattered. Major bridges over the Danube are broken and the shipping is impeded and the roads are impeded. His military structure is being severely hurt now. The first few days of the bombing were not as powerful as they might have been because of weather, but the bombing now is accelerating and intensifying. It's taking a real toll. He does that to get more public support. That's a pretty lousy deal for him.
So what did he do? He didn't, somehow, you didn't make your point clear enough or convincing enough, so he didn't believe it was coming? Is that a fair judgment?
No. I think that the
president... You were bluffing.
Well, let's talk about why I went on this trip, which took place 2 weeks ago today. The President and Madeleine Albright felt, and I completely agreed with them, that before the bombing began, it was essential that somebody look President Milosevic in the eye and say, you understand the consequences. We didn't want any war by miscalculation. We didn't want an aerial campaign based on him thinking we were bluffing. Anyone who's read Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, or is familiar with what happened in 1914, knows that World War I was avoidable and would not have happened if the staff people, the diplomats between Vienna, Berlin, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Paris and Moscow, or St. Petersburg, had been more direct with each other. But they didn't have telecommunications.
Well, some say the same thing about the Gulf War, that somehow the United States did not signal its intention to Saddam sufficiently well so that he understood the consequences.
I would disagree about 1991 based on what Baker and Bush have written in their books. But in 1914, that was an avoidable war. We were determined that before the NATO air campaign began, that we would make sure that the Yugoslav leadership, not just Milosevic, but the whole leadership understood. So the President and Madeleine asked me to go back and make the presentation, because presumably I had greater credibility since I had been the person who had been there when we bombed the Bosnian Serbs 3.5 years ago.
And successfully dealt with them at Dayton.
And Dayton and the October negotiations over Kosovo. So I sat there and gave him the choice. I said, you understand what will happen? He said, yes. You will bomb us. You will bomb us. That's understood. I understand you will bomb us. You're a powerful nation. You can bomb us. There's nothing I can do about it.
But there was no but to it. I know you can bomb me, but I can survive it. I know you can bomb me, but you don't understand the Serbian people. I know you can bomb me, but I have things I can do. I know you can bomb me, but you won't do it with all the power that you have in the beginning, so I'll have time to go in and push refugees into Macedonia, Montenegro, and everywhere else.
He made clear several things. One, that in his view, the effort to have an invited NATO peacekeeping force amounted to an invasion. I said, no, it isn't an invasion. He said, he gave me a speech about the Ottoman Empire, the Turks from 1389 to the collapse of the Ottomans at the beginning of the century, about the Nazis coming in, about Tito resisting Stalin. I said, this has nothing to do with that. He said, well, that's the way I view it. Then he said something which was very, very disturbing. I said, you know, you have to stop the military offensive. We have people on the ground reporting terrible things happening in some of the villages. I listed some specifics around Suva Reka and Mitrovica and so on. And he just said, this is Western misreporting under disinformation from the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA. And I said, look, we have a very serious difference of opinion here.
Now, well, what do you think he knew? I mean, was he simply thinking he could mislead you, or you think that he somehow is so out of touch with what's happening on the ground in Kosovo that he didn't know?
I can't answer that question. I've thought about it a lot. Did he believe what he was saying? Was there a reality gap here? Or did he not care anymore? Whatever it was, it's not my job to analyze him. My job was to make unambiguous to him what the consensus would be. Now, there's a very key point here, because everyone asks, did they understand? That afternoon, I went back to the embassy after several hours, and I said, when I leave, you understand that bombing will start within 48 hours. Actually, I knew it would be less, but I didn't want to compromise the security of the military action. Went back to the embassy and called Madeleine Albright, and we chatted, and we agreed on when I would leave and so on. While I was at the embassy, the Serb National Assembly had a nationally televised meeting. In the meeting, the Serb president, Milosevic, remembers, the president of all of Yugoslavia, which is Serbia and Montenegro, the Serb president, Milan Milutinovic, his closest associate, made a nationally televised speech in the assembly, and he said, Holbrooke has just given us the following choice: bombing or ground troops, and we must decide. So let's be clear, the Serb people knew what the choice was. There was this was not a 1914 war by miscalculation. This was an unquestionable decision by the Serb leadership, not just Milosevic, because the Serb National Assembly voted later that day. Before we waited till the vote, the decision was in effect to trigger the bombing of their own country, instead of accepting this very reasonable political offer.
Why?
I'm going to leave that to Serb historians.
Oh, come on. I mean, help me. Here we're about ready to... I mean, this thing gets worse and worse and worse,
well,
and we want to... Why do you think he turned it down? Why do you think they chose to be bombed? Is it because they didn't believe that it would be as serious as it is? Is it
You're asking me to explain their actions. With all respect, I think you should ask them to explain their own actions.
No, but
I don't want to
know them more than any other American, so I'm asking you to give me your best judgment as to why they chose to be bombed.
I've told you already what they said, that the choice you've given us is to have our sacred soil violated by an invading force. I said, this isn't an invasion, it's not an occupation, it's an international peacekeeping force that will save the Serb minority in Kosovo and so on. They said, it's not possible for us. They said, you don't understand our history. I said, while we're talking, slaughter is beginning in Kosovo, because this upsurge in the situation preceded the bombing. It had begun to rise ahead of the bombing, although it accelerated after the bombing and has now reached these biblical proportions, this 1945-style exodus.
And destabilizing throughout the region.
Particularly for Macedonia. But I'm not going to try to explain the other side. Get the Yugoslav ambassador in here, and he'll tell you his version of history. All I can tell you is that we walked the last mile for peace and took these actions as an unavoidable last resort in the face of a truly mind-boggling forced exodus.
Do you believe intensified bombing will bring Milosevic to an acceptance of the inevitable, that he has to make the concessions you said?
Well, that's the ultimate question. I am very reluctant to say yes, and I will not say no. All I can tell you is that the bombing must and will intensify if the Yugoslav leadership continues to follow the policies it has followed. And the intensification of the bombing will be very painful, and it will destroy the Yugoslav military structure. Meanwhile, if they wish to continue for a short time more the terrible, obscene things they're doing inside Kosovo. They may continue, but in the long run, it will not stop. You know, I mean, it won't succeed. I talked to Strobe Talbot yesterday, who had just come off the Macedonian border, where he talked to a lot of refugees. And he said that it was a searing experience for him, which from Strobe is a very strong statement. And he said that all the refugees he talked to said that they were in favor of the bombing, even if it had cost them their homes, at least temporarily, even if they lost loved ones who were missing, because they felt that the situation had reached a point where the only choices left to them were to be pushed out slowly or pushed out rapidly. So the answer to your question is the bombing must continue and must intensify until the Yugoslav leadership realizes that they have to change their positions.
Lots of people have questioned how well the bombing was carried out from day one.
Well, I said already that weather factors and other things got it off to a slower start.
Debate within NATO, other issues were there as to whether they could have done more. Maybe they expected better results earlier. Maybe they underestimated Milosevic. A lot of other things. But nevertheless, it hasn't had the impact that they wanted it to have so far.
Well, I think that statement would have been truer a few days ago than it is today. And I don't think
it's just going to get worse.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think that today's offer, inadequate than it was, was unrelated to the growing severity of these strikes. There are limits to air power, but let's not get ourselves all twisted up in a knot about the fact that air power can't succeed. This is 19 nations of NATO. This is a country surrounded by those nations. This is not Vietnam at the far ends of the earth with 60 million people.
But what you have is...
And this is not the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army under triple canopy jungle in tunnels that are under the rice paddies. We're talking about a different situation. And I think that it's making a tremendous effect, but I'm not going to predict how long or what the exact effect of it will be.
Is your policy position that there should be no let-up in the bombing? It should be intensified until Milosevic cries uncle?
Well, my personal recommendations to the Secretary of State and the President are obviously private. All I can say is...
what you think, not what you recommend to the President.
No. All I can say is that the administration will continue, along with its NATO allies, to intensify the bombing. If the situation continues as it does.
Do you accept the conventional wisdom that there is no choice because NATO's credibility is on the line?
I think that the NATO credibility issue is real, but I think the real reason for doing this goes way beyond the issue of credibility of the NATO organization, which is the most successful military alliance in history. This is about what is going on in Kosovo.
Senator McCain on this program last night said you can't turn back now because of the credibility issue. And you have clearly former Secretary of State Kissinger, former National Security Advisor Brzezinski, former National Security Advisor Scowcroft, so many people in the foreign policy establishment now prepared to say, if ground troops are necessary, then we ought to introduce ground troops in a non-permissive way.
Well, let's be clear that your viewers understand what this is. Non-permissive means invasion.
Right.
And the President and Secretaries Albright and Cohen have spoken to that problem clearly. There's nothing I need to add on it. I don't want to get in an argument with a group of people who you just named, all of whom I respect greatly, and whose core point, that we have to see this through, I fully agree with. But the President and the Secretaries have spoken to the point, and I think it's clear what the administration's position is.
Should we...
And I support it, by the way.
One of the reasons that Milosevic has not been castigated as much as some might have expected in the past was because at Dayton we had to deal with him. Some are saying that we ought to make clear to him that he is in fact going to be at the end game of this indicted as a war criminal and will have to give up power. What do you think?
The question of whether he's going to be indicted or not is in the hands of Louise Arbour and the International War Crimes Tribunal. That's a technical, legal issue. If they indict him, they indict him. If they don't, they don't. I have been very
puzzled at times as to why certain people weren't indicted earlier in the process. Last week they revealed an extremely important fact, by the way, which is that Arkan has been indicted.
This is the man that says to be doing Milosevic's dirty work in Kosovo.
He's a hands-on murderer. But on the question of indictment, that's up to The Hague. If they indict him, they indict him. If they don't, they don't. It would be totally wrong of the United States to interfere in that process.
Is the issue now so important because of its consequences, because of the capacity for destabilization, because of the messages it might send for the future, that if bombing doesn't do it, ground troops may very well be necessary?
Well, the administration has spoken to that issue. The President, Secretaries of State and Defense, as I said earlier, have made their statements. I support them fully, and I think that it makes no sense at all to start talking about something now when the bombing is getting increasingly effective and when the Yugoslav leadership has made a significant change in its policy just today. Let's just keep it up.
How do you think this is all going to end up at the end of the day, as they say? How will it end?
That's a tough question. I'm taking your question in the largest sense that you intend it. It's tough because of what we talked about earlier, the deep, abiding, historic hatred of Albanians and Serbs. Can they ever learn to live together on the same soil? The Serbs grabbed Kosovo when the Ottoman Empire fell apart in 1912. And so it was detached from the rest of Albania, which got independence in the same rough period around the time of World War I. Then Albanians, both in Albania itself and in Serbia, had a miserable political existence, and the Serbs took advantage of it. But remember this, the Serbs have the lowest birth rate in Europe, and the Albanians of Kosovo have the highest birth rate. So I don't think that either side is yet ready to recognize that they have to find a way to deal with each other. We have to help them get there. Otherwise, it's going to be like Ireland, where for hundreds of years, the two Irish communities found it impossible, even up to today in parts of Belfast and other areas, to live together, even though they really have no choice. It's a tragedy. So in the largest sense, when you ask how will it turn out, I am a long-term, basically I'm an optimistic person, as you well know, and it was the kind of feeling that we could do it, that we could make a difference in Bosnia, with a combination of diplomacy and bombing that got us to Dayton and peace in Bosnia.
The Croats on the march, too.
There are a lot of factors, but what I'm trying to make the point that Kosovo is much, much tougher than Bosnia because the hatred is so deep. So the international community has got two choices. They can turn away from it and say, the hell with you guys, kill each other as long as you want to, which I think is an unacceptable policy for strategic reasons because of its consequences, for refugee-driven reasons because it'll destabilize its neighbors, and for moral and humanitarian reasons, which are self-evident. Or alternatively, we can take the leadership role, which the United States and some of our European allies have done, and try to settle the problem. We did that through diplomatic efforts from May of last year until 2 weeks ago. Those efforts brought us temporary respite after our October negotiations with Milosevic. They fell apart at the end of January after the Serb slaughter at Račak, and now here we are. But this tragedy, this game, but it's a tragedy also, is far from over. It's got a long way to run, and one thing that encourages me, by the way, is the growing understanding of the American public about what's going on. Today's public opinion polls showed a growing support for the administration policy. That's obviously...
Which is what? To bomb Belgrade until Milosevic changes his mind, and you think that's what the definition of American policy is?
Just look at the NBC polls tonight. There was a substantial growing support for both the bombing and for the engagement. And the reason for it,
why do you think it is?
Because of what the Serbs are doing to the Albanians.
Because of the pictures they see of refugees.
That's right.
It breaks your heart.
Yeah, that's
and
a real...
people understand that as some... It's not unlike
this is not media,
pictures of people starving in Ethiopia.
This is
it's the same thing, except that...
This is not media manipulation. This is great television journalism by CNN and the networks. the regular networks, CNN's coverage has never been stronger, and the effect of it all over the world. I was told yesterday that CNN's viewership in Europe is even higher than the U.S., is stunning, and it plays into everyone else's hands, and people understand what's happening, and they understand that leaving it alone is not the right answer. So I would just caution your viewers to understand that this may take a while longer.
With this refugee situation, I assume you are of the opinion that the refugee situation was going to happen whether the United States and NATO allies bombed or not.
There's every reason to understand that the Yugoslav security forces had the plan all ready to go for a long time.
Was the mistake that we made is to not understand that they could create what they have created so fast and were prepared to move so fast before any full impact or ramifications of bombing was apparent to them?
Well, I'm not sure I follow the precise drift of your question. After the October negotiations, when 100,000...
Well, let me rephrase it then. They have had a window of opportunity to do a lot of obscene things and drive people from their homes and create from 100,000 to 300,000 refugees, and the bombing didn't make a dent.
Nobody ever thought that bombing could stop that. And there was no question. I think it's what the refugees said to Strobe Talbot on the Macedonian border yesterday. We were either going to get driven out slowly or more rapidly, and we'd rather have the bombing. I would just point out one important thing. After the October negotiations, when we sent in the civilian verification mission, we put NATO surveillance in the air overhead, and we started the political negotiations. You and I had a long talk about that on this program at that time. After that, we also did one thing that I didn't mention on the program that day because it was still classified. We got NATO into Macedonia right away, so that when the crisis hit 2 weeks ago, we already had a substantial NATO force in the most explosive country in the area, landlocked, tiny Macedonia, with all its borders under pressure. And those people have now, not only are they bringing some stability to fragile Macedonia, but they're also playing a huge role in refugees. Now, we didn't have NATO forces in Albania, which I personally would have liked to have seen, but it was, at that time, was deemed a bridge too far. But they are now moving in rapidly. And I saw on television yesterday Italian soldiers from NATO unloading refugee pallets and so on. So the military is in position to bring stability to the surrounding area. And of course, we're still in Bosnia, and I would stress to you that after 2 weeks of bombing in Kosovo, Bosnia is still holding, which is very important. So I don't want to mislead your viewers. I didn't come in your program tonight to spin people and say everything's fine or there's a light at the end of the tunnel or any of those phrases from when you and I first worked together in a long ago war in another part of the world. The situation is very serious because the issues involved are very serious. And I can't predict how long it'll be going on, but I think we should be very clear on what has happened and what has caused it and what the stakes are.
From a moral standpoint, did we have any choice?
You mean
to make the decision that we made about Milosevic?
He made the decision. We gave him the choice.
Well, I understand he made the decision. You warned him that there were going to be bombing.
If he did not
stop
proceed,
the atrocities in Kosovo
and agree to the international
and agree to
force,
an autonomy arrangement that would have led to soldiers in Kosovo, which he figured
did we
was
have any
violation
choice?
of his sovereignty. Do we have any choice? I mean, were the moral issues so important that there was no alternative for the United States? And if there is an argument against what the United States did and its NATO allies, it was they did not move with sufficient strength to make the case, did not made sure there were limitations in terms of how we executed, in terms of a gradual layering in of bombing, and 3, always posited that we had no intention of using ground troops.
Well, let's not get tactical considerations, the 4 you just listed, mixed up with the moral issue that you postulated at the beginning. On the moral level, I find that almost everyone accepts the morality and the necessity that there are times when you have to stand up to actions which are evil with force.
And this is clearly, in your judgment, one of those times.
Have you been watching the television today?
I have, Richard, but I mean, just answer the question. I mean, I have. And what is this one of those times? There's no question that the moral stake here was one of those times in which NATO had to be prepared to bomb.
They're emptying Pristina. They have been stripping the countryside of its population and killing and arresting and kidnapping young men. Something awful was going on inside Kosovo. We haven't had any reporters in there now of any consequence in almost 2 weeks. A couple of people are hiding in cellars, but we haven't had the cameras in. When we find out what happens, we'll be able to definitively say whether it was evil or not. In my book, I described the Bosnian Serb behavior. Thank you for the plug. Described the Bosnian Serb behavior as a question of evil, and I quoted the great psychiatrist Carl Jung as saying, "In the face of evil, man does not always know what to do." It was clear to me what it was. In Kosovo, I believe the evidence will show that similarly unacceptable things that transcended any rational bounds of normal conflict occurred.
And the evidence will show that our national leaders, whether they be diplomats or presidents or military, did not fail us in terms of executing their responsibility as well as they should.
Look, Charlie, I can give you many answers to that question, but I personally don't believe that this is a time for press manipulation or spinning.
Right.
The history will judge the success of this policy, its rightness, its effectiveness. I'll let historians judge when this story is over. In Bosnia so far, we know where we are. In confronting other great evils, Cambodia, Hitler, so on, we know what happened. This story is in its early phases, and history will judge the effectiveness of it. And right now, all we need to do is understand that there are great issues at stake and stand behind the military forces that are putting the men and women of the NATO air campaign who are putting their lives at risk, 3 of whom have been captured. And it's a very dangerous mission, but it is necessary.
Richard Holbrooke, his book To End a War, chronicled his own deep involvement in bringing peace to Bosnia. One of the people he negotiated with in that long process, Slobodan Milosevic, somewhere in Belgrade this evening, as Belgrade is bombed, the effort to bring some kind of end to a crisis that has been spreading across television screens across the world as we watch thousands and thousands and thousands of people driven from their homes, ending up on borders, simply looking for somebody to come and make a difference. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Charlie.
Back in a moment. Stay with us. We'll turn our attention to another issue.